Assalamu alaikum dear students. Hoping you are hale and hearty and must be enjoying the rainy weather nowadays. So moving on to our today's aims and objectives. As you know, we are done with certain types of software, system software, application software, internet applications, and different types of generally categorized softwares like licensed software, open source, shareware, and freeware softwares, etc. Now, last but not the least, we would be talking about the firmware software. It is not 100% a software, but is actually categorized as a software. So our today's objective is to basically discuss the concepts of firmware software. So we would be starting from that. What is basically a firmware? So in simpler terms, I can say that it is an embedded software which is actually embedded in the circuitry of any type of electronic gadget. It is an embedded software which is embedded in the circuitry of any type of electronic thing. Like as I've told you earlier in our second or third lecture, that every electronic thing, every electronic device around the world has some sort of processor and some sort of circuitry which actually controls the operation or activities of that electronic device, from a remote control, from a toy to any advanced machinery. Each and every device actually has certain circuitries, certain embedded softwares inside those circuitries which actually control the activities of those devices. So basically, firmware is a small piece of software, an embedded software which is embedded in the circuitry of a hardware, which makes hardware work and do what its manufacturer intended it to do. So firmware consists of programs written by software developers to make the hardware devices tick, to make the hardware devices work. Without firmware, most of the electronic devices we use daily wouldn't be able to work. They would not do anything. You can think of firmware simply as a software for hardware. So firmware is a software for hardware. So firmware is an intermediate form between hardware and software. It consists of software embedded in electronic devices during their manufacturing. So firmware is a software which is embedded into the circuitry of any electronic device inside the manufacturing company during the manufacturing process by the manufacturer. So firmware is not something, firmware software is not like an application software which we can download from the internet. So application software can be downloaded from the internet or installed inside the computer from CD. So firmware is not like an application software. It cannot be installed by the user. It is always installed into the circuitry of some device by the manufacturer at the time of its manufacturing inside some factory or inside some manufacturing plant. So it consists of software embedded in electronic devices during their manufacturing, for example, including hardware such as keyboards, hard drives, hard disks, graphic cards, printers, scanners, washing machines, microwave ovens, toys, refrigerators, home appliances like that, TVs, gadgets, computer hardware components, etc. All these electronic stuff actually has firmware software embedded in the circuitry. Firmware is a type of software that is associated with your hardware. Firmware is a software installed at the time of manufacturing inside any hardware. The firmware contains instruction programs to perform basic functions of any hardware. Firmware software actually controls the basic activities of any electronic hardware device. However, firmware is not an interchangeable term for software. It is not an interchangeable term for software. It has its own potential. It has its own spectrum. For example, did you know that a simple traffic light has firmware inside it? Yes, it does. And the firmware is what tells that traffic light to change from one color to another at regular intervals. For less sophisticated hardware devices like traffic lights, washing machines, barcode readers, surveillance cameras like CCTV cameras and TVs and so on, the firmware software is the software embedded inside them, and it also acts as an operating system for those devices. Interesting thing to notice here is that we have already told you that advanced computing devices like smartphones, like computers, have an operating system inside them in order to control all the hardware and software components inside those devices. But when it comes to IoT based devices like smart home, smart fridge, or even if we do not talk about the smart stuff, we talk about the regular stuff like common microwave oven, common refrigerator, common washing machine. These all less sophisticated hardware devices or less advanced electronic devices have actually a firmware software embedded inside their circuitry, and that firmware software inside those less advanced hardware devices actually acts as an operating system for them. Microwave ovens, refrigerators, or traffic lights or things like that doesn't have any operating system inside them, so they have that firmware software which actually acts as an operating system for them, controlling everything about that device's functionality. Here I meant to say this is that firmware software actually consists of small programs or consists of instructions written in machine language, written in binary language. As told you earlier that every software has been developed by some software engineer using some sort of programming language. When it comes to operating systems or application softwares, operating systems and application softwares are developed by the software engineers using the high-level programming languages. Their source code, the source code for operating systems and application softwares has been developed by using the high-level programming languages by the software developers. While when it comes to firmware software is developed by the software engineers or software developers by using the machine or binary language, because machine language is nearer or closer to the hardware. So when we say that firmware software actually controls the hardware, it actually successfully controls the hardware of electronic devices, less sophisticated electronic devices, because it is already developed using the machine language or low-level language or binary language or the language of zeros and ones. So I'll give you an example of a remote control. Let's suppose here C1, C2, C3 and C4 means buttons. Like C1 indicates another button of remote control, C2 indicates some other button of remote control, C3 indicates some other button, and C4 another button. So C1 up till C4, these are assumption based actually numbers given to the remote control buttons. So each and every, when you click or when you press any button on a remote control, when you press any button on the remote control, let's suppose this is a remote control of some TV. So when you press a button on the remote control, the circuitry of that remote control gets activated. The firmware embedded inside the circuitry of that remote control gets activated, and if you have pressed C1 button on the remote control, the firmware translates that pressurized button pressurized button signals into some binary code. Suppose the binary code for C1 button on the remote control is 101101. So when you press any button on a remote control, that pressed button actually generates a signal due to the firmware. Firmware gets activated. Due to the firmware's activation, the pressed button generates a signal, and firmware actually converts that signal into some binary code. To make things even clearer, let's take another example. A computer motherboard without firmware would not know how to detect the components attached on that motherboard. I'm giving you an example of motherboard here. As you can see here, this is a motherboard. So you can see that certain components are attached on the motherboard, like inductors, transistors, and capacitors, etc., and buses, and certain CMOS battery, BIOS battery, and certain components are attached on the motherboard. Your CPU is attached on your motherboard, RAM, ROM, graphics card, sound card, modem card. So certain components are attached on your motherboard. So if any firmware software is not embedded in the circuitry of your motherboard would not be able to recognize or detect the components attached on it. Likewise, it happens with the hard disk. As you can see in this diagram, this is a hard disk, and these are the circular platters of a hard disk. This is a proper hard disk which is installed inside your computer. On hard disk, you actually permanently store your data. So if your hard disk didn't have firmware software embedded inside it, then your hardware would not know how fast to spin or when to stop. Here we are talking about the platters, these circular platters of the hard disk. When you store some data on your hard disk, these platters actually move and store the data inside the hard disk. So if that hard disk doesn't have any firmware embedded inside it, then the platters of the hard disk would not know that when to spin, when to rotate, and when to stop. Likewise, a wireless network card, as told you earlier, a network card or modem card is attached on a motherboard. So a wireless network card or modem card would not know how to use a particular radio frequency if that modem or wireless network card doesn't have any firmware installed inside it. So for more complex hardware like smartphones, tablets, smart TV, smart watches, and so on, the firmware is the middleman between the hardware and the operating system. I'm talking about those devices which actually have some sort of operating system inside them, like cell phones, like tablets, like computers. So the devices which already have operating systems inside them, even those devices which have operating systems inside them, those devices too need firmware software, because in those type of devices, the firmware software would act as a middleman between the hardware and the operating system of those devices. On such devices, the firmware consists only the necessary instructions for the hardware to operate with the operating system that is installed on the device. Here the point is that there are certain devices like less advanced or less sophisticated devices like washing machine or your grinder or juicer, microwave oven, or things like that. So these are less sophisticated or less sophisticated computing electronic devices. So these type of devices have firmware software inside them, or these devices don't have any operating system inside them. That's why the firmware software acts as the operating system of those devices and controls all the activities of those devices. But when it comes to advanced sophisticated devices, advanced computing devices like tablet, smartphone, or computer, or a personal computer, PC, these devices already have operating systems inside them. So these type of advanced computing devices who already have operating systems inside them, these devices also need firmware software to control the basic circuitry, to act as a middleman. But in these type of devices, firmware performs very basic functionalities. For example, on a Samsung Galaxy smartphone with Android operating system, the firmware on the smartphone allows the hardware to communicate correctly with the Android operating system and do what is requested by the user. Means those type of devices in which operating system exists, the firmware only acts as a middleman between the hardware and the operating system of that device. So we often tend to think about a hardware device as a device that is just hardware, and we assume that it just works by itself. However, almost none of the modern hardware devices would work without this particular software that's embedded directly inside these devices. So none of the modern hardware devices work without the firmware embedded inside them. So in order to make your concepts more clearer, as you must be now thinking about that, you must be confusing firmware with other softwares, you must be confusing firmware with hardware, with drivers. So let's discuss some differences between firmware and software, firmware and drivers, and firmware and hardware. So first of all, we will discuss some differences between the firmware and a common software. As firmware is a special type of computer software that offers low-level control for the specific hardware of a device, firmware can act as a complete operating system for less sophisticated, less advanced computing devices. But in more advanced or sophisticated devices, firmware acts as a middleman, acts as a bridge between the hardware and the operating system of that advanced computing device. Or we can say that it acts as a complete operating system for less complex devices, or provides the standard operating system for less complex devices. In them, it performs all the monitoring, control, and data manipulation functions. While on the contrary, we can say that softwares, either we talk about the system softwares, these are the softwares which act as a basic platform for all the other application softwares to run, and they control all the activities and functions and all the hardware and application software components of the computer. But even in sophisticated devices, the software, the operating system or the system software is doing all the stuff, but firmware to some extent supports the operating system in performing certain activities, because it acts as a middleman between the hardware and the operating system. So it actually supports the operating system of high-level sophisticated computing devices. In high-level sophisticated computing devices, the firmware actually helps the operating system to control the hardware components at least. So when it comes to storage, where the firmware is stored, we now know that firmware is a software written or stored directly into, or it is embedded directly into the hardware devices. But how exactly is it stored on a device? Firmware inside a computer is usually stored in special types of memories called as ROM, R-O-M, ROM. So inside a computer, the firmware is stored inside a ROM chip. ROM stands for read-only memory. ROM is the acronym for read-only memory. Firmware is a set of instructions that is stored inside the ROM chip that provides instructions on how that device should operate. Unlike normal software, firmware cannot be changed or deleted by an end user without using special programs and remains on that device whether it's on or off. So another difference between a firmware and a software is of storage. Firmware is stored inside a ROM chip, and that ROM chip is basically attached on a motherboard, while where the common softwares are stored. All the common softwares are permanently stored inside the hard disk. So another difference is that firmware software, as it is not installed by the user, so the firmware software cannot be installed, cannot be modified, cannot be changed, or cannot be altered by the user. As the firmware software is installed or modified or changed at the time of its manufacturing, means the firmware can only be changed or modified or installed inside a hardware circuitry at the time of its manufacturing by the manufacturer. While when it comes to a software can be changed or modified by its owner or inventor or software engineer who has developed that software, can actually change the source code of that software, or if that software is open source, then it can be modified or changed by the user too. So another difference is of updations. This is the main difference between firmware and software. Once the firmware is installed, it does not usually changed often. It is changed infrequently. Means it is not changed, or it is not changed often, and it is not updated by the user, but it is updated by the manufacturer. But mostly it is not updated, mostly it is not changed, even by the manufacturer too. Once it is embedded into the circuitry of the hardware, that's it. And the supplier doesn't give you access to the firmware at all. On consumer electronics, hard disks and optical drives, etc., there is no chance to mess with the firmware. Once it is installed or embedded into the circuitry of the hardware, that's it. Now the user cannot change it. If you mess with the firmware of these hardware devices, a warning is that they may stop working. So besides updating the firmware, firmware is difficult since it sometimes requires the circuitry replacement and reprogramming through a special procedure. On the other hand, it is much easier to update a common software or a program, to update an operating system, to update an application software. When it comes to programming languages, as told you earlier, the firmware is developed, or the instructions of firmware are written by the software developer using the machine language, binary language, or low-level language, while the common softwares, operating systems, or application softwares are developed by using the high-level languages. So another difference is of size, that firmware resides in ROM chip inside ROM memory that is limited in size. So the size of firmware software is very small. Firmware can be as small as few kilobytes since it doesn't contain much data needed for user interface or graphics, while software files are large and take up a substantial amount of hardware memory. So common softwares, or the data of common softwares, actually takes much more space than the firmware software. Now let's discuss some differences between firmware and drivers. As we have already discussed the differences between a firmware software and a common software. Now let's discuss differences between firmware and drivers. While both have the role of allowing hardware to do what is requested of it, One important difference is that firmware is stored on the hardware device itself, while drivers are installed inside the operating system. As told you earlier, drivers are the part of system software, or drivers are a type of system software which actually detect any type of external hardware being connected with the computer. Let's suppose you are connecting some USB with your computer. Computer would not be able to understand or recognize that USB if the device driver of that USB is not pre-installed on your computer. If the device driver of your USB is not pre-installed on your computer, then you need to install manually a device driver inside your computer. Likewise, you attach any scanner or printer or camcorders or digital cameras or any external hardware devices with your computer. So for every hardware device, in order to get every hardware device recognized by the computer operating system, a device driver would be needed by the operating system. That's why device drivers are actually installed with the operating system. They are part of the operating system. While when it comes to firmware softwares are embedded inside the circuitry of the hardware, or when it comes to computer, they are embedded mostly embedded inside a computer, inside the ROM chip. When it comes to other gadgets, the firmware software is always embedded inside the circuitry of that hardware device. Also, firmware can start on its own when a computer gets switched on and do what it is programmed to do, while drivers must be run by the operating system. Drivers are always run by the operating system. But when you switch on a computer or you actually activate a device, its firmware automatically gets activated. The biggest difference between the two is that the firmware tells the devices what they should do, while the drivers tells the operating system how to communicate with the externally connected hardware device attached with a computer. That is a major difference between the firmware and drivers. So what kind of firmwares are available in the market? There is as much variety in firmware as there is in hardware devices. There is firmware in computer motherboard called as BIOS. There is BIOS, the firmware which is actually embedded in the circuitry of the motherboard. That firmware is called as BIOS, BIOS. There is firmware in the hard disks, hard drives. There is firmware in the solid state drives, SSDs, in CDs, in DVDs, in Blu-ray discs. There's firmware in network cards, modem cards. There's firmware in routers or modems. There's even firmware in your mouse and keyboard. So each and every hardware device has its own firmware embedded in its circuitry. So these are just some examples that are related to computers. You should remember that firmware exists in most of the devices that do something useful, like your TV, washing machine, ATMs of your banks, or even in your cars. You name the device, it probably would not work without its firmware. Now, last but not the least, let's talk about some of the differences between hardware and firmware. As we have talked about the differences between firmware and software, between the firmware and drivers, and now we would move on to the discussion of differences between firmware and hardware. So, first difference is, the main concept is that hardware is a physical entity, a tangible entity, to which you can actually feel and touch, which can be touched by you. So hardware is a physical entity, while firmware is a set of instructions. Like a software, it is a set of instructions. And second difference is that hardware is referenced as the body of instruments or devices, while firmware is referenced as the heart of instruments or devices. Third difference is that programs are required to run the hardware, like operating systems or firmware, while firmware is the program itself which is required to run certain type of hardwares. Fourth difference is that hardware cannot function without a firmware. A hardware, especially a less sophisticated or less advanced computing device, cannot function without a firmware, because firmware acts as an operating system in less advanced or less sophisticated computing devices, while firmware operates on the hardware. Fifth difference between hardware and firmware is that the hardware can go through physical damage, while the firmware cannot go through physical damage. The sixth difference is that a hardware may require reprogramming, while firmware never requires reprogramming except in some cases, in some rare cases. Seventh difference is that the user can easily modify the hardware, while in case of firmware, the user cannot modify the hardware because cannot modify the firmware, because the firmware can only be modified by the manufacturer in some rare cases. The eighth difference is the example of hardware are like, or let's talk about its tool. Point that hardware is a complete tool or device, tangible device, while the firmware is saved or embedded inside the circuitry of a hardware. And the last differences of examples. The example of hardware are like remote, keyboard, mouse, speaker, etc., etc., while the example of a firmware is like BIOS. BIOS is the firmware embedded in the circuitry of the motherboard, EEPROM chip, etc. So we are done with the complete topic of firmware, and here we mark the completion of the topic of software. We are done with all the types of software, from system software to firmware. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.